All right, we'll get started. Welcome everyone to our webinar, Changing the Tides, Taking Stock of Retailers' Seafood Sourcing and Forging a Path to Due Diligence. My name is Dana Cleveley, and I am the Program Director of Seafood Progress at SeaChoice. Today, you're going to hear three presentations, starting with myself. I will share SeaChoice's latest assessment on how retailers are living up to their seafood policies, followed by Nala Achi of FishWise, who will discuss how retailers can engage and take action on human rights due diligence. And finally, Ashley Ahrens of Oxfam America will discuss how commitments translate into operational change. We'll wrap up with some Q&A with whatever time remains, so please either hold your questions until the end or you can put them into the Q&A as we go. So I'll start with some background. SeaChoice is a collaboration between three internationally recognized orgs: the David Suzuki Foundation, Ecology Action Center, and Living Ocean Society. Since 2006, it has influenced retailers, seafood brands, certification bodies, and policymakers. Early on, we worked with major Canadian retailers to help develop sustainable seafood policies, and by 2016, all had policies. So we ended partnerships and shifted at that point to a watchdog role, holding retailers accountable for turning their commitments into action. Seafood Progress was launched in 2018 to foster a culture of accountability in seafood supply chains. From 2018 to 2023, we evaluated retailers on their progress towards sustainable and, to a lesser extent, human rights policies. Our assessments were framed around the 6 steps of the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions Common Vision. So we saw progress over those 6 years, but it also became clear where retailers were getting stuck. Investigations continue to show that human rights and environmental abuses are deeply interconnected and still widespread in seafood supply chains. 3 global themes drive these challenges. The first being the complexity of seafood supply chains makes traceability difficult. The second being that retailers often avoid or delegate responsibility for products they don't directly own or control. And finally, certification schemes and social audits are still the main tools used to ensure responsible sourcing, but they have clear limits. So, to accelerate adoption of due diligence approaches and enhance transparency across retailers' global supply chains, the 7th edition of Seafood Progress took a brand new approach. We swung far harder on this assessment than our previous 6, drilling down on the problem areas that are not specific to Canadian retailers or even seafood, but that we're learning are global themes across commodities. Our goal was to shed light on which products are truly and verifiably covered by retailers' sustainable seafood and human rights policies, the strategies behind what's covered and what's not, and to determine if retailers have real plans to improve upon what they're currently doing. So we're pleased to note that our decision to do such a focused analysis speaks directly to 2 of the challenges identified in the recently released landscape review by the Conservation Alliance. The first is transparency and commitments. The review found many business commitments are vague, limited in scope, and their actual impact is uncertain. Our report involved the first comprehensive analysis of the scope of seafood policies and how they're actually being applied in practice. The second challenge identified in the review is fragmentation of tools and guidance. Multiple actors are creating overlapping guidance, and participants called for centralized, harmonized direction. So to coordinate globally, we drew on the tone and scoring approaches of Bloom's Willful Ignorance and Greenpeace's High Cost of Cheap Tuna reports. Our methodology relied on FishWise's fundamentals for human rights due diligence to reflect current best practice. And finally, our recommendations are anchored in the OECD's due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, providing centralized guidance. And we'd like to thank all contributors, especially FishWise, for providing input on our scoring and for its ongoing collaboration with Seafood Progress since its inception. So we consider this a spotlight assessment covering just 9 KPIs, compared to 23 in our 2023 review. And it's divided into two sections, environmental with 5 indicators and human rights with 4. This year, we placed greater emphasis on human rights, bringing the balance closer to 50-50. And before I dive into the results, it's worth noting that we did not assess retailers on the standards their policies reference or their target timelines. We've covered those extensively before and found that while most retailers have policies and goals, the real gap lies in ambition and implementation. So we assessed 6 retailers: Costco Canada, Loblaw, Metro, Pattison Food Group, Sobeys, and Walmart Canada, selected for holding 5% or more market share in Canada, though several operate across North America or globally. This slide shows the retailer ranking, with Metro leading with a C grade and all other retailers receiving failing grades. Notably, Metro has consistently achieved the top overall score in all of our annual assessments. So the overall results are captured here. The average score across all retailers was a mere 38%, which is far lower than our previous assessments. This is not surprising, as we focused exclusively on the areas where we've seen minimal to no progress. All retailers are especially lagging on the human rights side of seafood, with an average score of just 30%. And I'll now move on to the scores by section and break them down a bit. Starting with engagement. So for the first time in seafood progress history, retailers were scored on engagement with SeaChoice to encourage and reward transparency regardless of performance. For example, Pattison Food scored last overall, but high on engagement, reflecting their willingness to learn and improve. I will note that we don't just email out surveys each year. We actually meet with all the retailers and the NGO partners who choose to attend and engage to ensure accurate data collection. The NGO partners that participate play a key role in the assessment process by helping retailers get clarity around the data asks and reporting tangible goals for improvement. We'd like to acknowledge OceanWise, who has been by far the most engaged NGO partner on all 7 of our annual retailer assessments. Unsurprisingly, retailers were far less transparent with us on our human rights questions at 23% than our environmental questions at 47%. Metro achieved the highest score for its timely and comprehensive communications with us and is the only retailer to have shared seafood sales data. That said, beyond considering this in terms of engagement, we did not actually score retailers on whether they shared this data or not. Despite most retailers not sharing the data, it was an interesting question to ask, and we credit Bloom for suggesting that we do. As we learned more about the traceability constraints that retailers face, such as identifying seafood volumes in prepared products like frozen meals and pet food, where seafood is but one of several ingredients. So as previously mentioned, this year we conducted a first of its kind in-depth assessment of the scope of sustainable seafood policies. In previous years, our focus was limited to products where seafood is a main ingredient, in fresh, frozen, and shelf-stable categories. This time, we expanded the scope to include indirect products that contain seafood as an ingredient, such as pet food, beauty and health products, sushi, and prepared items, including frozen or fresh meals, chips, dressings, etc. Our assessment found that nearly half of seafood products on store shelves are excluded from retailers' policies. Even more concerning, none of the retailers have outlined plans to cover these excluded products or banners. While the scope of sustainable seafood policies is typically well defined, human rights policies are often much broader, appearing to cover everything sold, including third-party brands, when in practice, retailers rarely investigate these supply chains themselves. Instead, they require brands to conduct their own due diligence and report back on any violations. So because of this disconnect, SeaChoice decided not to score retailers on the scope of their human rights policies to avoid any perception of fair washing or confusion, though we do explore this issue in the next section. So, when we looked at how retailers are verifying supplier compliance against their sustainable seafood policies, all but one has full chain traceability of the products their policies cover, but most are not effectively verifying this data. When we looked at how retailers are verifying compliance against their human rights policies, we found none of them require third-party brands to undergo risk-based audits, but all expect them to abide by their supplier codes of conduct and report back on any infractions. Additionally, none of the retailers are conducting investigations of high-risk products in consultation with local stakeholders or auditing to the vessel or farm level, which is considered best practice. And though most retailers have some type of grievance mechanism in place, SeaChoice was unable to determine the effectiveness of these tools and who is able to access them. In looking at the strategy behind the scope of policies, these two indicators saw the lowest average scores across all. Essentially, none of the retailers reported plans to include products or store banners currently out of scope of their sustainable seafood policies, take true responsibility for and investigate the supply chains of their third-party brand seafood suppliers, or look beyond certification and audit schemes and actively explore due diligence approaches to verifying supplier compliance against their policies. And finally, in considering how well embedded policies are into operations, it was encouraging to see that retailers are holding at least two people or departments responsible and accountable and have a discrete budget and resources dedicated to their sustainable seafood policy work. On the human rights side of things, however, the average score was quite a bit lower, indicating these policies are not as well embedded into operations. There's a lot more digging to be done on this topic, as embedding policies in organizations is widely seen as a prerequisite to meaningful progress. So, our results bring us back to the problems that I identified earlier, which were the complexity of global seafood making traceability very challenging. And this challenge, plus the need to stay competitive with prices, causing retailers to avoid responsibility for much of their products. And finally, a reliance on third parties to vet products as responsible is leading to green and fair washing and standing in the way of effective verification. And as evidence suggests, unethical seafood continues to make its way to store shelves. While these findings are overwhelming and undoubtedly daunting, we do want to commend the consistent engagement from retailers on their seafood progress profiles since 2018. We see their continued involvement and uptake of our recommendations over the years as an indication of their good intentions. Changing the tides is achievable. We are certain that retailers across the globe can improve upon their current practices, achieve effective full chain traceability, and adopt a due diligence approach to sourcing with the crucial support from NGO partners and organizations that are experts in these arenas and that will play an active role in helping retailers make meaningful progress. These include FishWise for guidance on human rights work and OceanWise for guidance on sustainable seafood work. As mentioned, we framed our recommendations around the 6 steps of the OECD's due diligence cycle. I won't go through these today as Nala and Ashley are going to cover the solutions side of things. Thanks, everyone. I will now pass it over to Nala from FishWise to discuss how retailers can move from embedding their human rights commitments to engaging and taking action on them.
Thank you, Dana. And thank you so much for that presentation. As Dana said, my name is Nala Achi, and I'm a senior project manager at FishWise. And before telling you a little bit more about FishWise, I just wanted to thank Dana and the SeaChoice team again for their work on this spotlight. It's really great to get such a detailed look at how retailers are approaching and implementing their sustainability and human rights commitments. And as Dana said, the reality is not that retailers want to be sourcing unethical products. Rather, the reality is that making meaningful, sustainable change in the seafood industry is hard. We're talking about supply chains that span multiple countries, jurisdictions, companies. We're talking about aquaculture and wild capture and processing. And we know that each of these sectors have risks and challenges that are specific to them. With that, next slide, please. So today I'll do my best to dig into the engagement and taking action steps of due diligence, building off of Dana's presentation. And as Dana said, I'll be focusing on the human rights side of things because that's where we're seeing retailers run into more barriers to progress and questions around how to actually implement their human rights due diligence programs. Next slide, please. And I'll start by giving a brief overview of the work FishWise does. So we have 3 areas of expertise: environmental sustainability, traceability and transparency with a focus on IUU fishing, and social responsibility. And we operate across 3 strategic pathways: direct supply chain engagement, collective engagement, and governance reform. Next slide, please. And in all of our work, we take a supply chain due diligence approach, which builds off of existing international frameworks on due diligence, including the OECD guidelines for responsible business conduct, which Dana just referenced, as well as the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights for that human rights due diligence focus. Next slide. So we've taken these frameworks and then adapted them to a seafood-specific context. So this slide shows FishWise's supply chain due diligence framework, which we use with many of our business partners. And while, as you can see, it doesn't match the OECD steps exactly, the 2 frameworks incorporate many of the same components. Next slide, please. Finally, and I promise this is the last slide with a circular due diligence graphic, but I would be remiss if I did not talk about RISE, or the Roadmap for Improving Seafood Ethics. So in FishWise's view and the work that we do, human rights due diligence is a component of broader supply chain due diligence. And we've put together a website, RISE, that provides free, publicly available guidance for companies on implementing human rights due diligence, again, with specificity for the seafood sector. And one of the goals of RISE is to address that fragmentation of tools and guidance that Dana mentioned in her presentation. So it aims to be a resource hub, a central location that references the different tools out there and how they all fit together. So I just wanted to acknowledge these different due diligence frameworks. And again, the important thing to remember is that they all incorporate the same components. They move from embedding responsible business conduct into policies and practices to collecting and assessing information to actually taking action, which includes seizing, preventing, and mitigating adverse impacts of business operations, as well as remediating impacts that have already occurred, and then tracking progress, communicating on that progress, and making sure that this process is iterative and continuous. Next slide, please. So now drilling down a little bit more into human rights due diligence, and I'm using the RISE steps as reference here. One of the key takeaways from the Spotlight report and prior seafood progress benchmarks is that companies, for the most part, are doing quite well when it comes to adopting policies and commitments and collecting and assessing information, at least on certain portions of their supply chains. However, there's still work to be done when it comes to embedding those commitments into company practices, culture, operations. Next slide, please. And then for this presentation, as Dana mentioned, I'll be focusing on how to engage and act on those commitments and that information that's collected. So how to meaningfully engage with stakeholders, including workers, suppliers, governments, and then how to take action, which I acknowledge is a huge step. It incorporates everything from building capacity to promoting responsible recruitment to developing grievance mechanisms and remediation processes. I obviously can't cover everything today. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll be focusing on some of the key challenges that we see retailers run into and some of the ways to address those challenges. And I know some people may be wondering why I haven't touched on the last 2 steps in this due diligence process, communicating and iterating. Iterate, I won't talk about too much because it's quite self-explanatory. So it's calling out that this process is cyclical and requires making improvements based on lessons learned. Communication, on the other hand, is not so self-explanatory. Companies have made big strides in communicating about their commitments and to some extent their due diligence. But the reality is that communication in the human rights space is really tricky. And that's actually the first challenge I'll talk about today. Next slide, please. So the three topics I'll be focusing on are communication, worker organizing, and connectivity at sea. And these are all complex topics, but there are some tangible steps that companies can take to make improvements in these areas. And before starting, I'd like to share the caveat that this is very much an evolving space. While we know what the ideal human rights due diligence process looks like in theory, it's still a challenge to fully translate that into practice, especially given varying regulatory and regional environments. So we're constantly learning, figuring out what is feasible, what is most impactful, and how to maximize change with limited resources. And as much as we want things to happen overnight, the reality is that they won't. As Dana said, we know from investigations and the work of civil society and worker organizations that there are still many issues in seafood supply chains, including, unfortunately, some very severe violations. And companies definitely have a responsibility to dedicate time and resources and people to address those issues with the urgency they require. And at the same time, we can acknowledge that change takes time. Next slide, please. Which leads me to my first point and one of the dilemmas of this space, what I call the transparency or communication versus reputational or regulatory risk dilemma. So this idea that companies are running into a challenge where they don't want to or feel that they can't publicly share information about their due diligence activities and the issues they may uncover because it opens them up to reputational or regulatory risk. And we know that public communication and transparency is a key component of due diligence. So this dilemma is something that the space really needs to figure out. And from the company side, there are a few things they can do, including sharing not only policies, commitments, codes of conduct publicly, but also information about how they're implementing those policies via due diligence activities, including successes as well as challenges that companies may be running into. And then a second recommendation on this point is for companies to show how they are meaningfully participating in this work, and particularly how they may be engaging with civil society or worker organizations where it's possible to co-design human rights due diligence processes and iterate based on lessons learned. Next slide, please. And that piece around engaging with worker organization leads me to my next challenge and also an area of opportunity and really something that should underlie all of a company's human rights due diligence work. Research shows that worker organizing is by far the best avenue to uphold worker rights. Obviously, the realities of worker organizing really differ across different regions, sectors, fisheries, supply chains. On the screen, you can also see a spectrum of worker-led approaches. There are different ways that workers may organize. What's important to keep in mind here is that we are seeing initiatives and movements related to this across the world in the fishing sector. So in Ecuador, Ghana, Mexico, Thailand, there are different cooperatives, unions, informal worker organizations that are forming. And to learn more about this, I highly recommend reading a recent paper from the Fisheries Governance Project and the Accountability Research Center titled Upwelling Fishers Organizing for Their Rights in Sustainable Fisheries. And we can send a follow-up email with a link to that. But there's still confusion around what it actually means for companies to, quote unquote, create an enabling environment for freedom of association and collective bargaining. Next slide, please. And while I can't fully answer that question right now, I can provide some recommendations. So first off, we know that many companies already have policies that say they support freedom of association and collective bargaining. And it's really important that companies put that into practice by, first of all, definitely not actively hindering worker organizing, but rather engaging in efforts that seek to level the power dynamics between workers and employers. And in order to do this work, companies need to understand that worker organizing is context dependent. They need to do the work to map their supply chains and know what's going on in different areas to determine how best to engage. And then finally, the last recommendation is to actually engage, so to work with civil society and worker organizations to determine how best to take action in these different supply chains. Next slide, please. The final topic I'd like to cover is connectivity at sea, with a focus on Wi-Fi, since that is emerging as the likeliest technology for achieving connectivity. And why is this topic important? Wi-Fi on vessels can achieve a number of outcomes, including alleviating worker isolation and increasing their ability to report grievances and hopefully access remedy. And it's particularly relevant right now because technology has really evolved a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. So while Wi-Fi access may not have been a possibility in the past, it is very much becoming one. And it also makes business sense. You can leverage Wi-Fi for a number of purposes outside of worker rights. As with all things, Wi-Fi at sea is context dependent. It's going to look different for industrial versus small scale vessels for different lengths of trips or how much data workers have access to. Again, I can't answer all the questions right now, but I can point you to some very good recent resources, including the Model Operational Guidelines for Wi-Fi Access from Global Labor Justice and a number of other organizations, and then the Global Seafood Alliance's report from last year on Wi-Fi provision on vessels. Next slide, please. And in terms of recommendations for companies on this topic, the first would be to do this work in multi-stakeholder or pre-competitive forums as much as possible, because that allows companies to not only scale impact, but also address the dynamic nature of seafood sourcing. So a company may not necessarily source from the exact same vessels year after year, but they likely do source from the same regions or fisheries. So if they can work with other companies that overlap with their supply chains, they can more effectively have impact. The second recommendation would be to identify existing efforts related to Wi-Fi at sea, especially in high-risk supply chains. And then, as I said throughout the presentation, to engage with relevant organizations and government agencies that are already working on the ground. And then the last recommendation on this is to build lasting relationships and capacity with suppliers and producers to implement Wi-Fi on vessels, again, leveraging that recent research to determine what's feasible to understand best practice. Next slide, please. Okay, that was a lot of content. I was really trying to move from the theory of due diligence to what it might look like in practice, focusing on these key topics that we've seen emerging in the space in recent years. And there are clearly some key themes that emerged. There's no one size fits all for human rights due diligence. There are obviously different roles and responsibilities across the supply chain. So these are the things that are important, particularly from the retailer perspective, but they're only one piece of the puzzle. And you'll hear in the next presentation, there are many other practices to consider. But so talking about these key themes that emerge, the first theme is that human rights due diligence is context dependent. That's why knowing your supply chains, building lasting relationships with suppliers based on trust and shared responsibility, and prioritizing action based on risk is so important. The second theme is engage, engage, engage meaningfully, thoughtfully, and respectfully with civil society and worker organizations, again, where possible, to co-design due diligence processes and amplify existing on-the-ground initiatives. And finally, human rights due diligence is iterative. It takes time, it takes resources, and it takes a willingness to learn. And hopefully webinars such as this one help with that process of learning. So that is all for me. Thank you so much. And I will pass it back to Dana.
Thanks so much, Nala. We will now turn to Ashley of Oxfam to explore what it takes to incorporate human rights due diligence in purchasing decisions. So over to you, Ashley.
So hi everyone, I'm Ashley Aarons at Oxfam America, where I lead a lot of our work in working with seafood buyers around human rights due diligence. So you'll be happy. I've only got 4 slides, so we can move to the next one. But I just want to say, big thanks to our speakers. Definitely, so much of that resonated. I'm going to be touching on more on some things Nala said, but from what's coming out the earlier report from Dana, I definitely see all those. Like I work a lot with US retailers and other buyers. And for instance, I just do see this over focus as an example on the certifications. And it's quite often I'm in conversations with processors or there's factories that there's just so many audits happening in those factories that it's actually taking resource away from worker voice mechanisms and for actually acting on the insights that might come out of audits or worker engagement. And I just think we need to just shift where our resources go away from the audits that towards the worker voice mechanisms and towards the actual human rights due diligence. So that was something that really resonated for me. So I wanted to starting by sharing a report recently out. So this is from the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, and Oxfam has supported this. And that is a group of kind of ethical investors. And they just very recently published a report around what investors care for in terms of the companies like they own the shares in or they lend money to in the seafood sector. And I think it's interesting because it's another angle. It kind of talks about what are the risks to investors? What types of questions investors should be asking? But it's really pertinent here and really adds on to what Dan is saying and Nala, but it highlights some good examples, particularly from the US and where there's room for improvement. So we'll share around the link, but that's one I really recommend reading. So next one. And if you read that report and listen to Nala as well, what really strikes is this area around supporting worker voice. So Nala's touched on this a lot, so I'm just going to give a few examples. I want to give some actual examples of some of the businesses we work with, engage with to support the previous presentations. I think if you're listening to this and you're wondering where is a good first step for yourselves, many of you know that are beyond that, but a good first step is about the worker voice. And there's lots of, I think, good practice out there, rights holder engagement. So we're seeing more businesses carrying out human rights impact assessments in the seafood sector, which aren't audits at all, go much beyond that and really provide a space for workers and their communities to trust the system, to trust the kind of methodology, to reshare their concerns and have a sense they'll be listened to. Oxfam supported a lot of assessments here and also developed guidance about how to make these more resource efficient. I've seen quite a few more initiatives around grievance mechanisms. So on the right, my images are a bit befuddled, but that's from Ahold Delhaize's kind of human rights report we have to do every 2 years. That talks about how the grievance mechanism is accessible to anyone in their supply chain, and it gives numbers about the usage. They have a policy for non-retaliation. And I think it's great to see this and see more businesses setting up grievance mechanisms for their seafood supply chains. Definitely ways they can improve, not enough remediation, often over-reliance on kind of atomized individual like surveys rather than workers being empowered through their unions or if not through NGOs. But definitely lots of progress, I think, around grievance mechanisms. As Nada mentioned, Wi-Fi on vessels. I'm seeing more buyers committing to that. So there's a picture of Whole Foods' recent seafood code of conduct, which talks about them making the commitment requiring more and more Wi-Fi on vessels. And again, to businesses listening, it would be great if you could make that commitment or move in that direction around requiring and supporting Wi-Fi on vessels. This is maybe a bit new, but I wrote a blog recently that shared what Asda in the UK is doing, Hy-Vee in the US, Bolton in Italy, where they have published the vessels they buy from. Which is a really powerful thing to do because that allows kind of workers in supply chains and the people who support them a chance to flag to buyers if there has been abuse on vessels. Um, which means they can be resolved. And the blog kind of goes into more depth around that, around why that's in the business's interest. And it's quite clear that means issues can be resolved very quickly, at this early stage, rather than getting bigger and bigger and more risky to businesses. So there's some great examples of businesses publishing the vessels they buy from. Um, I wish I had more examples to share in addressing barriers to freedom of association, and I saw we had a question on that we'll come to later. But before we get to that, it was a striking. Here's a quote from Greenpeace. Additionally, no retail from they do an annual tuna scorecard. No retailers were able to show that they source any real percentage of tuna from vessels with democratic and independent trade unions. And if any of the listeners here have examples from their own businesses or how they're supporting unions in seafood, it'd be great to see more of those examples. And I think later we will come to some of the activities people could be doing. Next slide. Anyway, the focus of my work though is really on procurement, and so this is really about trying to get to the purchasing practices. And I think for the buyers here, maybe you're on the buyers here, maybe you're on the sustainability team or the buyers team or somewhere else. We see a lot of this great work, voice initiatives from the sustainability team, but your company has so much power in influencing the supply chain through your purchasing practices, through the size of them, how they influence the supply chain. And then there's questions about how do you negotiate prices, what's in your contract, what are the terms, and what are the lengths of contracts, things like that. So the purchasing practice of seafood buyers has such a big impact on human rights down the supply chain, and recent reports by Cal and Sustainability Incubator in the shrimp supply chain talk about that. But that's kind of coming from an NGO perspective. But this quote in the bottom right, which I'm going to read out, is actually from one of Europe's largest retailers, which says the key issue in relation to the tuna supply chain is that the cost of sustainable and socially responsible production is currently not a fully integrated part of the market price. So essentially, the price that they are paying for their tuna isn't covering the human rights and environmental protections that they believe those workers should have, and indeed they have kind of committed to in their own supplier code of conduct. They're just not paying enough for that to be possible, no matter how great everything else is. So Oxfam has recently published some guidance for businesses on this. That's the image at the bottom, emerging good practices on embedding human rights into seafood procurement. So we couldn't think of a snappier title. But really recommend, great if you can read it, give us some feedback. It's aimed for businesses. It tries to share examples. We interviewed a lot of the leading seafood buyers, and you'll see examples of them throughout it. And the way we think about it is like if you have already made a human rights commitment, this is about aligning your day-to-day purchasing practices with that. So it's not a new commitment, it's just ensuring this internal alignment. We're currently working on next steps on this. Happy to talk to anyone about this. If you're in the UK, the Ethical Trade Initiative are starting a new pilot looking at shrimp purchasing from Southeast Asia, which I'm happy to share more about, but I'm very excited about. I think that could be one of the most interesting initiatives in our sector. Next slide. And this colorful slide is my last one, and this just gives a taste of what's in the report. So on the left, you have the areas that the guidance looks at, and in green, that's where we saw quite a few examples. Orange is where we saw one or two examples, and red, there were no examples, though the literature suggests there should be. I think the slides aren't great. You can see I'm not using AI yet for my slides. But where you can see green, it's great to see, towards the top, some businesses using their human rights impact assessments to address procurement, doing surveys of their suppliers to understand how their procurement practices are affecting suppliers' practices. We're seeing sustainability teams providing some training on human rights to their purchasing teams, their buying teams. But those are often a bit high level, just focused on conventions and not covering core what purchasing can do to human rights. And so we're beginning to speak to a couple of buyers around how we could help the sustainability teams enhance their trainings for buyers. We're seeing a great move towards long-term sourcing relationships. It really creates a lot of confidence in suppliers that they can invest in certain improvements and they have space for that. And then, other areas you see red, we were a bit surprised we did not see any buying teams that had KPIs that mentioned human rights. We were a bit surprised by that, and we're now speaking to a couple of businesses about maybe experimenting with KPIs for buying teams around that. Living wages, we saw some pilots in aquaculture, but maybe not so much. But not so much overall. There's some in aquaculture, but there was only one pilot starting in wild capture, which was work by Bolton, that Oxfam is supporting in tuna in Ecuador. But we're quite excited by that to see how we can learn from that as a sector. And then maybe the last two, sustainable costing and preferential sourcing, I think where we're going to be focusing our time. Sustainable costing is really if you're a buyer, it's, do you have confidence that the price your supplier is quoting you at, that includes all of these human rights and environmental supports to workers? or if if when you look at the price, is it just so low that you think that isn't possible? And so we have examples in the report of quite a few buyers talking to suppliers to kind of check, talking exactly that through, talking about their code of conduct, talking about if the price covers that. There are some examples of companies really asking for extra data within the overall price quoted to them of the labor costs. And preferential sourcing is really, if you're a buyer, are you willing to buy a bit more, or provide better terms to a supplier that's really investing in human rights to pay more, or more feasibly have longer contracts, or bigger quantities? And there are some examples in that of it's maybe simple stuff, but of just in some cases you have the sustainability teams telling buyers, don't buy from those companies. But the better examples where sustainability teams were also involved in the weighing up of bids coming in. So suppliers' bids were weighted on things like price, quality, uh, but also on the human rights records of their suppliers. And anyway, so an examples in that, and then the report kind of takes all of that practice and turns it into some recommendations across the project cycle. Anyway, so I mean, just bringing that all together, I think if this is kind of maybe new to you and you're looking for some good practice, I would really, the worker voice is a lot more accessible. It's a lot more about what's happening. There's a lot of examples about that now. But if you want to go even further and look at the root cause of a lot of abuses, I think a lot of that comes down to procurement, and we'd love to talk to you more. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and everyone. So our aim with these presentations collectively was to take you through a full journey of human rights due diligence, from assessing where companies stand currently to putting commitments into practice through meaningful engagement and action, and then finally looking at how to integrate considerations into purchasing decisions. So thanks so much for attending, and to those who are listening after the fact, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Nala, or Ashley with further questions around our presentations.